What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Reformed Reader, the channel where we review different forms of media through the lens of a Christian who is under the authority of the scriptures. My name is Josh, and today we are going to be doing a review of Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. So let's start with, what is this book about? Ryland Grace is the sole survivor on a desperate last chance mission, and if he fails, humanity and the earth itself will perish. Except that right now, he doesn't know that. He can't even remember his own name, let alone the nature of his assignment or how to complete it. All he knows is that he's been asleep for a very, very long time, and he's just been awakened to find himself millions of miles from home with nothing but two corpses for company. His crewmates dead, his memories fuzzily returning. Ryland realizes that an impossible task now confronts him. Hurtling through space on this tiny ship, it's up to him to puzzle out an impossible scientific mystery and conquer an extinction-level threat to our species. And with the clock ticking down and the nearest human being light years away, he's got to do it all alone. Or does he? All right, guys, so the way that I normally structure my reviews, I go over the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start with the good. What were some things about this book that I liked? There were two in particular. One was Ryland, and the other was Rocky. Our characters were phenomenal. Those two in particular, loved those characters, loved their dynamic, loved their dialogue. The dialogue in this book is next level. It is so funny and engaging. I loved the dialogue between these two characters in particular. Also, the plot, while not overtly original in the sense that he's got to go on a mission to save planet Earth from extinction, so he has to go and travel into space to collect data for certain things. I don't want to get into spoilers, but how Andy Weir approaches it is original, because we start with our character waking up and knowing nothing. He doesn't remember his name. He doesn't remember where he's from. He doesn't remember anything. And he just wakes up on a spaceship beside his two crewmates who have already deceased quite some time ago. And now he has to try to figure out what's going on. And then periodically we see flashbacks where our character Ryland is beginning to remember certain aspects about himself, about his mission, and about how he can solve this problem. So that was a really interesting way and original way, in my opinion, to sort of launch, no pun intended there, but to launch this story into the reader's mind, because we are sort of thrown into it with him, with our main character, but we are learning alongside him. So one of the things that Andy Weir does is he really delves deep into the science of his books. Now, with as many degrees and letters after his name as Andy Weir has, I would expect nothing less, especially after reading The Martian. So he does dive deep into the science, but he is able to break that down in small, digestible bits for the layman like myself, and makes me able to understand and grasp really complex themes and concepts and different approaches to scientific theory and those types of things. So again, that was a really interesting thing to do. So I did like the plot. I really loved the characters, but more than anything, I really loved the dialogue. Now let's get into the bad. And what I mean by that is these are the things in the book that didn't work as much for me. These are like stylistic choices, or maybe a character that I didn't like, or maybe the way it's written or the way it's structured. So let's go into the first bit. And the first is, in part, lines up with the good. And what I mean by that is he dives so deep into the science that sometimes it seems like he's just showing off. And what I don't mean that in an overly critical way, in the sense that I'm like, oh, well, he just knows so much science and he just wants us to know that he knows so much. It's not me being overly critical of him in that sense, but I do think he gets a little heavy-handed. And now the reason I say that is because I've actually read this book twice. So I read it pretty soon after its release a few years ago and absolutely loved it. I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. It was one of my favorite books that I had ever read up to that point. And then later last year, so I think it was around October, November, I decided to revisit it through audiobook. And I was listening through it and I realized that there were things about the book that I'm really not as crazy about either anymore Or maybe I was just smitten with the new book syndrome, it's the shiny new book. So I have to love everything about it. And so I definitely think that could be the case. It could also be the case that my taste just changed a little bit, but he did get pretty heavy handed with the science. Also, knowing the plot, the end, knowing the story already probably played a part in why I didn't enjoy it as much the second time around. So that was a big thing. Another thing is that Ryland was a bit of a Mary Sue here. And what I mean is he just wasn't ever really bad at much. And anytime that there was a problem, he all of a sudden had, a jarring memory come up that helped him to solve that problem. Now, I understand why Andy Weir did that. He used that as a writing device and I think used it well in that sense. But I do wish that it was less of, I have a problem. Oh, wait, here's a new memory. And now I can solve the problem. I wish maybe that those came, either the memories came a little more frequently or that we were able to see some of these things a couple chapters previously. So then when we get to that, we as the reader are able to connect a little bit better and go, oh, well, he already knows how to do this because of said memory or whatever. But I just think that it became a little too much of, well, he has a solution to every problem that's thrown at him. So that did pull me out of it a little bit. Another thing is Andy Weir has a very particular writing style. So if you've read The Martian and you weren't a fan of that, you won't like this. Also, another thing another consistency that Andy Weir has to me as a negative is all of his characters are pretty similar. And what I mean is their demeanor, their candor, their snarky attitudes, their quips that they throw at one another are all extremely similar. Now, I don't mean similar in the sense that how I joke with my buddies at work, but similar in the sense of you could almost take Mark Watney out of The Martian and put him in this book, and it's kind of the same guy. And for those of you that have read Artemis, even though we have a female protagonist in that book, it's pretty similar. It's Mark Watney, but in different books. It's like Mark Watney went through Quantum Leap and was jumping into different bodies. That's sort of how our protagonist is here. But then also our main side character in this book, and I don't want to give too much away, but his dialogue and Ryland's dialogue were so similar that it was almost as if he was having this conversation with himself. Now, I understand why he did that. And if you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. He did that so that there was some commonality between Ryland and Rocky, but it was too similar for me. It was like, okay, I get that you guys are making fun of each other, but it just seemed too similar in that way. It was too familiar. I would have loved a little bit more diversity in the dialogue or diversity in their characteristics or their traits or their backgrounds, something that would help us as the reader to differentiate our characters, not just in this book, but our characters from this book and his previous books. So other than that, wasn't really a whole lot that I had that I disliked, which leads me into what I call the ugly. Now, what I mean by the ugly is what are some sins that might be steeped into the work that might hold a Christian back from picking this up. And so I break this down into 5 categories and I rank them on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least severe and 10 being the most severe. And so let's go into our first category. Our first category is going to be violence and brutality. I gave this a 3. There's really not a lot of violence or brutality in here. There are a couple of scenes where there's some accidents and some injuries take place, or for instance, like the summary states, when he wakes up and he finds his crewmates already dead. It does go into a little bit of descriptors there. So it's not so much violent, but there is some brutal language there that's descriptive in that way. So not a lot, which is why I gave it a 3, but there is a little bit. So just know that before you dive into it. I think the entire book is probably pretty PG-13 for the most part. But yeah, the violence and brutality, it's not really there except for when an accident happens and somebody gets injured. So let's get into sexually explicit content. I gave this a 2. There's not really anything in here. and there probably shouldn't be. And the reason is because he's in space by himself. It's going to be difficult to have any type of content like that. Now, there are a couple of flashbacks where our main character meets some people, or there's some discussion with our two main characters about anatomy. And I don't want to go really any further into detail there because it will get spoilery at that point. But there are a couple of conversations that are pretty descriptive with the human anatomy. So that leads me into the language. Now, the language, I gave a 7. The language can get kind of heavy at times. Not so much that it pulled me out of the story and not so much that it made me put it down, but there were a few instances where our main character had a few outbursts, frustration or anger, or there were a couple of side characters in flashbacks that decided that they would let their language fly a little more freely. And I think there was 1 or 2 instances of some of the heavier hitters, but for the most part, the language was fairly tame. So I would say at its peak, it's around a 7 out of 10. And so this leads me into gratuitous inclusions. Now I put this at a 3. Now the reason is because when we go through a flashback of Ryland going through his preparation for his mission, I do think that a few characters could be seen as being included as far as maybe their gender or their nationality or their religious beliefs. I think that some of those were kind of thrown in there for the sake of being more diverse. I understand again why he did it, but I don't think it's anything that somebody's going to pick up and go, ooh, this book is leaning real heavily on diversity and inclusion, so I'm going to put it down. It's not that, but there were a couple things where I'm like, how come all of the super smart people are all women? Not that there aren't smart women, but there's no smart men around you, or how come everybody around you is a Muslim? All of our geniuses are Muslim women. Now I say all, I'm obviously being tongue in cheek, but there were a few instances like that where I was like, okay, I get it. Let's move on. It doesn't pertain to the story at all. It doesn't pertain to our character at all. So let's just keep moving forward. So as far as gratuitous inclusion, I put it at a 3 because there's a couple times where I just kind of rolled my eyes and moved past it, but there's nothing really glaring there. And finally, we get to dark themes, and I also gave this a 3. Now I put dark themes at a 3 because our main character at times comes to a crossroads or an impasse where he must decide what he's going to do. And during that time, he does contemplate some darker or heavier themes here. And so I wouldn't say this is for a young reader. I would say this is for a mature reader or a more mature reader, meaning mature in age and mental faculties, not mature in necessarily their faith. I just mean actually older. Because there are some heavier themes discussed here, such as the extermination of all of human civilization and what that could mean or what that might look like. So there are a couple of heavy themes here. So just know that going into it. But again, it's nothing glaring. It's just there are some things, the conflict that our main character is dealing with does deal with some of those heavier themes, which makes him sometimes contemplate the darker side of things. So overall, it leads me to this question. Would I recommend this book to a Christian? Absolutely. I think a lot of people would really love this book. It's a fantastic science fiction book. It's clean for the most part. It's a fun read. It's got some really witty dialogue in here. It's got some characters that will stick with you. It will actually make you laugh out loud at times. And it's a message of hope and friendship and love. So I definitely think that I would recommend this to most Christians. Now, if you're looking for a book that has 0 language, this probably isn't for you. Just wanted to let you know that up front. But otherwise, this is a great book. This is a great science fiction book. So if you like science fiction, especially if you like science fiction that leans a little heavier on the science, to me, this is an excellent read. Also, I think this is Andy Weir's best writing. Now, I don't mean this is my favorite book of his, but his writing has certainly improved since his first book. So that is another reason why I would recommend picking up this book. So if you love sci-fi and maybe you don't really know where to start, or you're just looking for that palate cleanser between fantasy reads, or you just want something I just want to have fun with a read. I don't really want to, sit here and have to delve into magic systems and new worlds and those types of scenarios. You're gonna really enjoy this. So I would recommend this to most Christians. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Again, I appreciate you guys so much. Please, more than anything, make sure you share these videos to your Christian brothers and sisters, because I want to be a good resource for them and for you, so that maybe we can all spend our time, energy, and money more wisely towards things that don't directly dishonor the Lord. So guys, again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.